Okay, good. I think we're ready to start. So I will start with a prayer. So good evening, good afternoon, Heavenly Parents. Good afternoon, true parents. We've now gathered together to start our third week of joining the dots. And it's a time for us that we want to dedicate this time to listen and also to think, and maybe to think even more. But it is through listening that we can learn new points of view and ways of thinking that we haven't been conscious of before. So I really pray that through listening, you can bring into our minds new ideas, maybe even ideas that are different from Uncle William's, but that you can really talk to us through our curiosity and through our open mind. And we want to offer this time to you and make an effort to understand this world better so that we could better bring good things into this world instead of continuing on maybe ways that are faulty. So we thank you for this opportunity. I want to start this now together with you and together with all the brothers and sisters here. And this I pray in all our names, in my own name, Verani and Warfare Blessed Central Couple.
Okay, so thank you all very much for coming, and especially, it's the third week already, and I'm really grateful, that so many of you still here into the third week. And, one never knows how these things are going to turn out when one starts off and whether there's going to be anybody after a couple of days. But, yeah, really happy that so many people are finding these talks interesting enough to be able to want to come back day after day. So I'm just going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to carry on where we left off. And yeah, so this is one of these, brought this up many times, this way of making sense of the nature of reality, which goes all the way back to the Greeks, to Pythagoras, and basically came to permeate the whole of the European cultural tradition, our language, our way of framing and making sense of the world, such that people aren't even aware of it. But this here, you might think, well, okay, that's that. So, well, how does that work in the world today? Well, if you look at the world today, you can see, it's basically the background to this way of understanding the world. So if we look at modern discourse, look at modern things that are going on in society, we can see a lot of people, they divide the world up into two different classes or two different groups. There's the oppressed and the oppressor. There's the poor and the rich, the lower class and the upper class, black and white. And, I've met, often people say black people cannot be racist, whereas the white people always are inherently racist. Female, male, LGBTQ+, straight, cis, socialist, capitalist, internationalist, patriot, people who work in the public sector for government and those kind of things, and people who work in private sector businesses. And generally speaking, everything in this side here is regarded as being good. Everything, if you fall into one of these categories here, you are generally speaking regarded somehow as being suspect or even bad. And so what are the implications of this way of looking at the world? First of all, it's a form of what we call essentialism. That means good and evil, or good and bad, are not to do with your character, but by which category you fall into. If you fall into one category, you are regarded as inherently being oppressed and therefore good. Or if you fall into the other category, inherently an oppressor and bad. And that's the Marxist way of looking at things. If you're in the proletariat, then you are inherently good. If you fall in the ruling class, you're inherently bad. And so because you're inherently bad, if you're part of the ruling class, this is then the ideological or philosophical, intellectual justification for the elimination of the ruling class. And no matter how good they were in terms of their character, because they belong to this particular category or this particular group, therefore they should be deprived of all their property, arrested and sent off to the gulag. That's the way it worked. These ideas, they have consequences. And so that means, as I said last time, people are able to commit terrible crimes with a clear conscience, when they see the world in terms of these people are good and these people are evil. Yeah? And so here you end up with a lot of stereotyping on both sides, a lot of stereotyping. And basically this is a form not only of essentialism, something is inherently good or inherently evil, but also one falls in either one category or the other. Again, we looked at this idea of dualism, the idea that good and evil are woven into the fabric of the universe. And so one is therefore either wholly good or one is therefore either wholly bad. And there's very little distinction. The Nazis also picked up this theory. It became this sort of racial theory. If you belong to the Aryan race, you got blue eyes and blonde hair, you're inherently good. Whereas if you're Jewish or you're a Slav, you're inherently in a lower race, a lower genetic category. And yeah, if you're Jewish, then you're subhuman. And then also you can be treated in a way that other people wouldn't be treated. And again, there was this distinction between German science, which is good, and Jewish science, which is bad. So the other thing is, you either fall into one category or the other. There's no spectrum. Yeah, no spectrum here, no distinction between one or the other. And so it becomes a problem then when people don't fit completely into one category or the other. And so people who are black or working class, who don't vote for Democrat or don't vote for Labour, are often accused of being traitors to their class or traitors to their race. And you got this from Joe Biden just a few weeks ago. He said something like this. You got this debate in the House of Commons last week with Priti Patel, who's Asian, but she's a Conservative Home Secretary and being accused by the other side. Yeah, how can you possibly be Conservative? You're a traitor to your race. You know, this whole kind of debate, whole kind of arguments like that. And also the other thing is, because everybody's either on one side or the other, either wholly good or wholly bad, there's no recognition that in reality, people are flawed. There's nobody who is wholly good. There is nobody who is wholly bad. Every single human being is a flawed person, a mixture of good and bad. But again, coming back to Pythagoras, as Aristotle said, one side has to eliminate the other. So in Pythagoras' day, the Greek world, it was the good, which is a male, straight, everything like that. The right-handedness has to get rid of the other category, which is female, left-handedness, crooked, etc. Whereas now it's just the other way around. And again, you can see this playing out into the stuff that's going on in the streets today. So first of all, as I said, this isn't an accurate description of reality. The world is not like this. So what they're trying to do then, they're trying to impose their view of the nature of reality upon the world. And so this basically is all about power. It's all about controlling the vocabulary. What is it to be a woman? Do you really need to have a womb? Do you really need to menstruate? So J.K. Rowling got herself into big trouble a week or two ago when she tweeted that women have wombs and women menstruate. And then she got attacked by all the trans people. She got attacked by all the actors and actresses who were in her plays, Daniel, whatever his name was, and the other ones. They all disowned her. And they encouraged people to go around burning Harry Potter books. Interesting. So a lot of it then is about controlling the vocabulary, controlling definitions, controlling the discourse and the narrative to control the story, yeah, and their account of all the things that are going on. So if you can control the discourse, you can control the narrative, that gives you power to impose your understanding of the nature of reality upon everybody else. And anybody else who has a different story, a different interpretation, a different way of making sense of reality, you say you're evil, you're the oppressor, and you have no right to open your mouth, you have no right to give your opinion, because by definition, your opinion is evil because you're on the wrong side of this table of categories. That's the way it's working. That's what's going on now in these identity politics and gender politics, and now it's racial politics. Yeah. Or it's argument about statues and things. Either someone's wholly evil or they're wholly good. And you can see it all over the place. Okay, so the question is, are people wholly good or wholly evil? So this is really precious. This is someone called Alexander Solzhenitsyn. When I came across his book when I was about 14 or 15, A Day in the Life of Vida van Denisovich, it removed the scales from my eyes. and it changed my life to understand what was really going on in the world. And when I was a teenager, I read all his books. And so this is comes from, I think, his last book in the Gulag Archipelago. So he was an officer, I think, or at least a soldier during the Second World War. And he wrote a letter back from the front when he was in the Soviet army, the Red Army, fighting against the Germans. And he wrote a letter back in which he expressed some criticisms of the way the war was being directed. Anyway, somebody picked up this letter that he wrote and accused him of being disloyal. And so he was arrested and he was given 9 years prison sentence just for expressing some mild criticism about the way the war was being directed. And he spent 9 years then in the Gulag, in the forced labor camps. And then he wrote these books, trilogy of books and lots of other books. So he said, it was granted to me to carry away from my prison years on my bent back, which nearly broke beneath its load, this essential experience. How a human being becomes evil and how good. In the intoxication of youthful success, I felt myself to be infallible, and I was therefore cruel. In the surfeit of power, I was a murderer and an oppressor. So he was a member of the Communist Party, and so he, as he said, he did all kinds of bad things, believing that he was right to be doing these things. Yeah, and you see a lot of young people, see them on the streets today, pulling down statues, very, very similar. In the surfeit of power, I was a murderer and an oppressor. In my most evil moments, I was convinced that I was doing good, and I was well supplied with systematic arguments. And it was only when I lay there on rotting prison straw that I sensed within myself the first stirrings of good. Gradually, it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nations, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years, and even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts, there remains an uprooted corner of evil. That's him there when he was a Zek, as they're called. Since then, I've come to understand the truth of all the religions of the world. They struggle with the evil inside a human being, inside every human being. It's impossible to expel evil from the world in its entirety, but it is possible to constrict it within each person. And since that time, I've come to understand the falsehood of all the revolutions in history. They destroy not only those carriers of evil contemporary with them, and also fail, out of haste, to discriminate the carriers of good as well. And they take to themselves, as their heritage, the actual evil itself, magnified still more. So they actually become even worse than the people they've eliminated. They become even more evil than the evil people they fight against and eliminate. And again, you can read a lot of this sort of stuff when you read commentaries about what's going on now, the sort of racial thing that's going on in America and also Britain, and the way that some people are categorized as, well, because you're white, therefore you're an oppressor, you're evil, you're inherently racist. If you're a policeman, therefore you must all be bad, etc., etc. And it's the same kind of dialogue rooted in this Pythagorean understanding of the nature of reality and human beings. And it's phenomenally dangerous. So what's a biblical view? So I talked about that last time. Also, compassion and justice within God. God expresses themselves as a God of mercy and a God of justice. And the point is, sometimes people say, well, God shouldn't be punishing people. But the point is not that whether God punishes people or not. The point is, as I said last week, the point is, in societies which believe that God is a God of justice and a God of justice, so if in societies that believe God is a God of love and compassion and mercy, and also they believe that God is a God of justice, these kind of societies are much more compassionate, much more forgiving, yeah, much less revenge going on, yeah. So the question is not a question, well, whether God goes around punishing people and sending them to hell or not. That's irrelevant. We can never know that in reality. But all we can say is if you believe God is like that, the kind of society that is created is a much better one than ones where people believe God is all loving and all forgiving and nobody gets punished and there's no justice after you die, in which case people have to go around getting revenge and imposing justice in this life. So again, this is from the book of Ezekiel, similar kind of theme. Therefore, Son of Man, say to your people, if someone who is righteous disobeys the law, that person's former righteousness will count for nothing. If someone who is wicked repents, that person's former wickedness will not bring condemnation. The righteous person who sins will not be allowed to live, even though they were formerly righteous. So when it says live, basically go to heaven. If I tell a righteous person they will surely live, but then they trust in their own righteousness because they become very arrogant, and they do evil, none of the righteous things that person's done will be remembered. And you can see that happens to people's reputations. They will die for the evil they have done, or they go to hell. And if I say to a wicked person, you will surely die, but they then turn away from their sin and do what is just and right, if they give back what they took in pledge for a loan, return what they have stolen, follow the decrees to give life, and do no evil, that person will surely live. They will not die. So notice it's there. It's not just about repenting and saying sorry. You actually have to do something. You actually have to try to restore the mistakes that you made. You have to give back what you've stolen. Yeah, you have to go around and apologize to the people who you offended. Yeah, not just repenting to God. That's not enough. You actually have to restore what you actually did wrong. None of the sins that person has committed will be remembered against them. They've done what is just and right, and they will surely live. Okay, so that's how God sees it. Now, the interesting thing is how people, what's said next. Yet your people say, so God is saying, yet your people say, the way of the Lord is not just. So people are saying it's not fair. The way God treats people is not fair. It's not fair, for example, that God says that people who repent will be forgiven. Or maybe they say it's not fair that some people will go to hell. That's interesting. Your people say the way of the Lord is not just. But it is their way that is not just. If a righteous person turns from their righteousness and does evil, they will die for it. And if a wicked person turns away from their wickedness and does what is just and right, they'll live by doing so. Yet you Israelites say, the way of the Lord is not just, but I will judge each of you according to your own ways. So you might wonder what's going on here. People say the way of the Lord is not just. So the second commandment was do not make a graven image. So sometimes people have an idea of what God or Jesus is like. Yeah, but God didn't say it. God said, yeah, God is how he is, and not, that's what I often think. You know, people often say, oh, God is like this, or God is like that. But God is how he is, and that's not necessarily how we think he is, and he's not necessarily how we think he ought to be. Yeah, and so sometimes I think people cast God and Jesus in their own image. Whereas you actually read the New Testament, you can see Jesus is incredibly straight. He's not going around just being nice and forgiving. He's incredibly straight. And he's the person, there's more stuff about going to hell and heaven and hell in the New Testament, much more than there is in the Old Testament. God coming across the New Testament is far more judgmental and really punishing the bad people, much more than it is in the Old Testament. So I think sometimes people, like the Israelites here, they say the way of the Lord is not just. In other words, God isn't the way we think he ought to be. But actually we have to understand God is the way he is. That's why it says, and when God spoke to Moses, God said, I will go on being how I will go on being. God is who he is, not necessarily how we think he ought to be. So that's why it says, in the Old Testament says, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. And sometimes people say, well, why should God be taking vengeance? Well, the reason is because God is a God of justice. And that's the whole point. Yeah, God is a God of justice because he wants to have a just and good society. So that's why St. Paul said, beloved, never avenge yourself, never take revenge, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I'll repay, says the Lord. And so, you know, you have to ask yourself, well, what's going on in the world today? Are people taking revenge? Are people taking vengeance on people who lived hundreds of years ago? That's the question. Yeah. Whereas God said, that's not right. You shouldn't be doing that. No. Vengeance is mine, our place as the Lord. Because otherwise what happens, as we looked at again last week, you get this cycle of revenge. Yeah. People feel very moral about it. They think I'm honoring the previous generations by taking revenge upon the present generation. That's this whole cycle of revenge, which goes on for years and decades and generations. It's still going on now for hundreds of years. But that doesn't create a very loving, compassionate, and good society. That creates a society which is permeated by violence. Yeah? And as we saw the time of Noah, what God abhors more than anything else is violence, because he hates his children getting hurt and being this violence. So this idea of God being a God of justice and a God of mercy, I thought, well, how does that work? So again, I read something last time to you from Jonathan Sacks talking about the Middle Ages. And somebody wrote this, a friend of mine called Matthew Cohen, he wrote this on my Facebook just a few days ago. And this is what he wrote. First, to set fire to their synagogues or schools, this is to be done in the honor of our Lord and of Christendom, so that God might see that we are Christians. Second, I advise that he's talking about Jews here, their synagogues, the Jews. Second, I advise that their houses be razed and destroyed, burnt to the ground. Third, I advise that all their prayer books and Talmudic writings, in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught, be taken from them. Fourth, I advise that their rabbis be forbidden to teach henceforth on pain of loss of life and limb. Fifth, I advise that safe conduct on the highways be abolished completely for the Jews, for they have no business in the countryside. Sixth, I advise that usury be prohibited to them, and that all cash and treasure and silver and gold be taken away from them. Seventh, I recommend putting a flail, an axe, a hoe, a spade, or distaff, or spindle into the hands of young, strong Jews and Jewesses, and letting them earn their bread in the sweat of their brow. But if we are afraid they might harm us or our wives, children, servants, cattle, etc., then let us emulate the common sense of other nations, such as France, Spain, Bohemia, etc., then eject them forever from the country. Who do you think wrote that? Hitler? Goebbels? Can't get a much more anti-Semitic statement than that, can you? These are the words of Martin Luther. Yeah. These are the words of Martin Luther. And this is Matthew Cohen saying, these are the words of Martin Luther, who changed the world for the better. It's a Jew saying that, despite reading all that racist, anti-Semitic diatribe, which was used by Hitler and inspired Germans for 500 years. Incidentally, almost every major church in Germany has a Judensaw, a Jew pig, relief on its outer walls, showing a rabbi and Jews suckling from a pig. So here's one here. Yeah, on the outer wall of, we said, nearly all German churches. You got a pig, and you got a rabbi, and you got Jews. This is an incredibly, unbelievably offensive anti-Semitic image. Yeah. They're still there. My dad, at 10 years old, I knew his, well, I know Matthew's dad. He's a wonderful, gentle, kind person. My dad, at 10 years old, was locked with other kids in a German synagogue. The place was boarded up. Then the Germans torched it to burn the kids alive. But his dad was able to escape, and his whole family and everybody was burned. My family were obliterated, tortured, raped, and pillaged by Germans. And no German has ever said sorry to me. There were never any reparations, nothing. And I don't need nothing, because religion, certainly not secular humanism, taught me that I have also hurt countless people with my silliness, selfishness, bigotry, stabbed their hearts. And further, the sole purpose of our life is to love, forgive, beyond logic, and to empathize without limitations. I'm no longer a member of the Unification Church, but I can say it was only Reverend Moon who taught me how to overcome my bitterness. But I know his dad. His dad, who was the one who escaped from this synagogue that had been set on fire, he is a very gentle person. Again, he had no bitterness. Yeah. And so the question is, well, why not? Because of his, even though he's an atheist now, he was brought up in that kind of culture where you don't take revenge. You say, God will take vengeance. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Leave it up to God to do that, and you get on with your life. Yeah, that kind of attitude, that kind of view. Yeah. So here, I would never want German churches, sculptures, or Luther pulled down. Yeah. So again, we reflect upon what's going on in the world today. Yeah. When you take down these things, you're obliterating the memory. But if you actually leave it here, it actually makes, you know, if I was a German, I walked past this, I would feel so ashamed. Yeah. And so if you're left up, there's a statue in Bristol in England, which was pulled down a few days ago because there was a statue of a person who's a slave trader, and he earned loads of money from slavery. But then he donated all the money to build schools and hospitals. And so the statue's there. So what should be written on that statue? This is a slave trader, but he gave his money. And then, you know, when you see that, people feel ashamed of what he did. But if you remove all these things, you remove your history, airbrush out the history. Okay, so moving on a little bit now. That's a bit lighter. So commands. So we're looking there at law. So we looked at the 10 Commandments. And so the vision then for going into Canaan was that the Israelites then, they don't want to be governed by human beings. They don't want to be governed by kings. They didn't want to be governed by pharaohs or by anybody telling them what to do or ordering them around. They want to be governed by laws and not by commands. In other words, by the rule of law. And so what are the nature of laws? Laws, first of all, are very general. They're abstract and not specific. In other words, it doesn't tell you what to do. It just tells you what you cannot do. You shall not murder. Okay, that's simple. It applies in the same way to everybody. It doesn't tell you what you should do, or you have to regulate your life and do this, this, and this, and this. It's not about regulations and telling people what they should do. It's just laying down a few simple things which are not allowed to do. Yeah? So they're very, very general laws, not specific, and very abstract. The other important thing of the rule of law is that laws are equal. In other words, the same law applies in the same way to everyone. No one is above the law. The king is not above the law. The people working for the government are not above the law. The police are not above the law. Everybody, the law applies the same way to everybody. It doesn't matter who you are. If you mistreat somebody, then you should be subject to the full force of the law. So nobody's above the law. There's no privilege. That's what privilege means. It means you don't have to follow the same rules that everybody else has to follow. That's the second thing. And the third characteristic is that laws are certain. So when laws are very certain and they don't change, then it enables you to make plans. You know, okay, these are the laws, and these are going to be the same laws over the next 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or for the rest of my life. That means you can make plans. You can take into consideration what the laws are because they're very certain. They're not changing all the time. It's so frustrating, you know, when you're living in a modern democracy or modern country where the government changes mind, it passes new laws, and all the things you thought which were legal suddenly change and become illegal. So how can you plan your life? How can you plan your business? How can you plan this or that if the government can just go around changing the laws? So laws have to be certain and unchanging in that sense. And also the rules and boundaries have to be enforced. So when you say laws are certain, it means they have to be enforced. So you know that if I do this, I'll be punished. If I do that, I'll be punished. If somebody else does this, they will be punished. If somebody else does that, they will be punished. So these boundaries and these rules have to be enforced. And that's very important. So somebody asked me, I don't want this. Okay. So somebody asked me last week about this. Where it talks about a person in the Old Testament being put to death because he broke the Sabbath, violated the Sabbath. So let's have a look. Here, this is the commandment given in Mount Sinai. Therefore you are to observe the Sabbath. It means you're not to work, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person should be cut off from among his people. So there's the law, it's very clear. And there's the punishment, that's also very clear. Okay, so what happens? Now, while the sons of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. In other words, he's working. And those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. And they put him in custody because it had not been declared what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, the man should surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. So all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So it sounds really cruel. But you have to understand, well, why was that done? Okay, first of all, the law has to be certain. Yeah. So if it says here, if you do this, that'll be the punishment. So if somebody does it and they're not punished, then people think, oh, the law doesn't mean anything. It means I can get away with it. Okay. Or if the law is applied arbitrarily, oh, we'll apply it to you, but we won't, and punish you, but we won't apply it to this other person. Yes. The law has to be certain and applied equally to everybody. And so by doing this, everybody knows, okay, that's the law, and the punishment will certainly follow. And of course, if that happens to one person, then the boundary is established, the boundary is reinforced, and everybody thinks, oh, if I do that, that'll be my punishment, and I'm certain to get stoned to death myself. And of course, that's a great deterrent. So you don't read about lots and lots of people getting stoned to death or violating the Sabbath, because people didn't violate the Sabbath. They understood it's serious, and it's a certain law, it's not going to change, and there's certain consequences which follow from breaking that law. So that gives certainty. Yeah, and it's exactly what you have to do. If you're running a school, if you're running a classroom, as a teacher, you may have certain rules about how everybody in the classroom should behave. But if one of the pupils or students breaks the rule and nothing happens to them, you say anybody who breaks this rule, they'll get a detention or whatever it is. But someone does it and they don't get a detention, then suddenly everybody thinks, oh, that rule is a rule, but if I break it, there'll be no consequences. And then gradually, very quickly, you have a breakdown in order. Yeah. And the rules then don't apply anymore. And therefore, there's not a learning environment for people, and people's education becomes damaged, yeah, because there's no longer an educational environment within the classroom. So that's why it's very important then for a teacher to explain very clearly, these are the rules, these are the consequences if you break the rules, and then also then to make sure that actually carries out their word. So when someone breaks the rule, they do it. And then everybody realizes, yes. So as soon as the rule is announced and the consequences, of course, somebody's going to push against the rules and break the rule. And everybody wants to know, is the teacher serious or not? And if they find out the teacher's not serious, then you end up with social disorder after a short time. And it's very, very difficult to regain order within a classroom and to recreate a learning environment. So that's the way it works. And that's the way it's supposed to work. It has to be a clear rule, a clear punishment that everybody knows. So it's not arbitrary. It's not, oh, I didn't realize that the punishment is going to be so serious or so severe. It has to be explained very clearly. This is the law, this is the rule, and these are the consequences if you break the rule. And then it's necessary for the law to be upheld. Really important for the teacher to uphold the law or the rule. And it's also very important within society that the law should be upheld. And there should be no exceptions. It should apply just the same way to someone who's an important politician as it is to somebody who's just an ordinary member of society. It's really important for there to be justice. At the same time, there's also the rehabilitation of offenders. So when men have a dispute, they're to take it to court. So and the judges will decide the case, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. So again, this is the last of the rules set up during the time of Noah. Every society, not just Jewish society, every society, this is universal, has to have a justice system. So you don't get people having to take revenge by themselves when you get this feud. So that's why you have a dispute, you go to court, and then an independent, impartial judge will decide the case and will acquit the innocent, yeah, and condemn the guilty, so the guilty person then gets punished. Yeah? So then it's no longer about revenge, it's no longer about retaliation, it's now about justice and establishing and maintaining the boundaries. If the guilty man deserves to be beaten, if that's the punishment, the judge shall make him lie down and have him flogged in his presence with the number of lashes his crime deserves, whatever, how many. But he must not give him more than 40 lashes. Why? If he's flogged more than that, your brother will be degraded in your eyes. So it's not about humiliating somebody. It's not about degrading somebody. It's not about revenge. Yeah, it's about justice. Yeah, that's all. And maintain the boundaries. So this is Jonathan Sacks's commentary. So the sages inferred the principle that when the guilty has received the punishment his offense deserved, he's restored to his earlier status. In other words, he's paid his penalty. Yeah. For example, he's permitted to be a witness and his testimony has not been invalidated by the fact that previously he'd been found guilty of an offense. The stain on his character is temporary and not permanent. Offenders are to be rehabilitated. That means that when you've served your sentence, then you can go. Everybody regards you. He has served his sentence. He's now rehabilitated and is now a regular and ordinary member of society, and he can apply for any job that he wants to and should be treated as an ordinary member of society and not be treated as a criminal. Yeah, that's from the Bible. Yeah, you shouldn't. The stain. He's paid his price, etc., and is now rehabilitated and now has full rights as a regular citizen and a member of society, and a crime he committed shouldn't be held against him. It's wiped out, yeah, not remembered against him. So that's the biblical idea of justice then. It's all about rehabilitation, maintaining a good and stable society. Then somebody also asked me about when Moses said about killing the people after. Anyway, I'll tell you what it was about. Okay, so Moses went up onto the mountain. He fasted for 40 days, and then God gave him the 10 Commandments. At the same time, while he was on the mountain fasting for 40 days, the people wondered where Moses was. They said, "Where is Moses? We haven't seen him for 40 days. You know, he didn't take enough food to live for 40 days in his rucksack. You know, there's no takeaways up there. There's no bottled water for him to drink. Maybe he's just died." And so they came to Aaron, and they said to Aaron, "We don't know where Moses is. Please create gods for us to follow who can lead us into Canaan." And so, anyway, God heard about this. God was upset, talked to Moses, and Moses calmed God down. And then Moses went down the mountain, and when he approached the camp and saw the calf, the golden calf, and the people running wild, dancing, so they were running wild. They're completely out of control. It's like social chaos. His anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them. Okay, what about that? Is it good to? His anger burned. He lost his temper. Yeah, did it really help that he broke the commandment? That he broke the tablets? Did that make anything any better? Not really. He had to go up the mountain again, fast another 40 days. And this time he had to carve them and make them himself. And you can imagine having had to carve out the tablets himself with flints, you can imagine he took a lot more care of them than the ones he got as freebies from God. But also, that's a problem. You know, if you get angry, you can often do things and damage things, and it doesn't really help. So if you're a teacher in a classroom and the classroom becomes disordered, often you have to make it look like you're angry. And then, you know, the people in the classroom, they get shocked and they quiet them down, and then you just carry on. So you're having to make it look like you're angry. You're having to make it look like you're upset. And as a parent, sometimes you might tell your children off, but you don't lose your temper. You're not actually angry. You're just make it look like you are. And then very, very quickly just tell a joke or calm everybody down. Anyway, sadly, tragedy, his anger burned, he lost his temper, broke the tablets. And then he told the Levites, God's orders are, strap on your swords and go to work. Cross the camp from one end to the other. Kill brother, friend, and neighbor. 3,000 of the people were killed that day. Okay, so there's about 600,000 people, and they had run amok. There's rioting, there's social disorder, there's mob rule. And when that kind of situation happens, as you can see in any city, when there's rioting and mob rule and there's social disorder, a lot of ordinary people get hurt. A lot of ordinary businesses are burnt down. A lot of ordinary people suffer extraordinary violence. Anybody who stands up to the mob and says, calm down, gets beaten up and murdered themselves. So what's the alternative here? If Moses had just went and said, oh, excuse me, would you all mind calming down? They wouldn't have paid any attention to him. Just like, if you leave a classroom or the classroom gets out of control, and a teacher comes in, the classroom's out of control, the teacher goes along and says, excuse me, would you all mind being quiet? Then it'll just carry on. And so usually what happens, a teacher may have to shout or do something just to restore order. That's really important. Just like, if you get social chaos in the streets, people's houses are being burnt down, businesses are being looted, then people expect the government to restore order. Yeah, that's necessary. It's really important for the government to restore order and to maintain justice. It's not about imposing order, it's about restoring order to the way it's supposed to be. And so that's what was going on here. He said, kill brother. In other words, you don't discriminate between people you like and people you don't like. If you see anybody who's misbehaving and breaking the law and behaving in the way they're not supposed to, you have to punish them, which here says to kill them. And so 3,000 people were killed that day. Okay, so very quickly you can imagine when they started doing this, people realized, gosh, this is serious. We better calm down. We better settle down. We better stop rioting and, all this social disorder. So that's the way it is. So sometimes when you're a leader, you have to make tough choices. Nobody wants to do this kind of thing. But if you're responsible, like a teacher, you're responsible for maintaining a certain kind of environment within the classroom. That's your responsibility, to establish a learning environment and to maintain a learning environment in which all the people in the classroom feel safe. When there's disorder, the vulnerable get hurt. They're not safe. They don't feel safe. Job of a teacher, a job of a leader, a politician, a president, is to keep people safe, which is to maintain order. And if there's social breakdown, to restore that order again. And it's tough, and that's what Moses did. It's a tough call, and he felt at the time, that was his judgment, the only way in which to restore order was to do that. Obviously he wasn't happy, not at all, but that's what he decided to do. Okay, another aspect here about freedom, because we looked at freedom again last week. This is what God says, the time is coming, declares the Lord, but I'll make a new covenant with the people of Israel and Judah. It won't be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. They broke that covenant with me, even though I was their husband, declares the Lord. So again, it's a covenant like the relationship between a husband and wife, really intense. No, this is the covenant I'll make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I'll put my instructions within them, and they will be my people. I will put my instructions within them and engrave them on their hearts. Okay, so the Mosaic law was engraved upon the tablets. So in that sense, the law was something outside. But here he says, I'll put the instructions within them, engrave them on their hearts. So this is in their conscience, yeah? The law is written within their conscience, engraved on their hearts. So this is another idea, a Jewish idea of freedom. I will be their God, and they will be my people. So they will no longer need to teach each other to say, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. So everybody then will grow up with a conscience, a personal understanding, recognition, experience of God living inside them. It's not on the outside, or the first covenant, but it's something living on the inside. And so when people are living entirely according to their conscience, then they feel completely free. Yeah, I told you, freedom, it's like you're free within the law. You can't do this, this, and this, and this. That social space which is created. But here, it's like an inner freedom. You can't break the law. You can't go against your conscience because your conscience is so strong. And so that's very much like this idea in the principle. In the ideal world, because people's horizontal relationships with each other are rooted in their vertical relationship with God, So one of the interesting things, you look up the word vertical in the divine principle, every single time the word vertical is used, it's always used exclusively to refer to a person's relationship with God. It's never about a relationship between one human being and another. Vertical relationship is always a relationship with God through conscience. The only time when it's mentioned vertically is when it's talking about vertical conditions of indemnity that have been inherited through the generations. They will form an integrated and interdependent society in which they share all their joys and sorrows. In this society, to hurt someone else would be experienced as hurting one's own self. Hence, its citizens simply will not want to commit crime. That's just what Jeremiah is describing, maybe more poetically. Yeah, that kind of world where people, that their conscience is so sharp, they're so strong, they wouldn't hurt another person, because to hurt another person, they would feel that pain as if it were their own. So then becomes an integrated society, a God-centered society. God is dwelling and living in that society. Okay, so as I said, there's 615 laws. I just went through a couple of them there. There's a lot of depth there. You can spend weeks and weeks just going through the meaning of these things. As I said, all these laws there are to create a good society. And you can see there the idea of, establishing and maintaining boundaries. We can see there the ideas of rehabilitation. These are very modern ideas in Europe. The idea of the purpose of going to prison and punishment is rehabilitation. For a long time, it was not like that at all. So a lot of these things which are revealed there 3,500 years ago, the basic framework for establishing a good, peaceful, and just society. So all these laws then, basically are about translating a vision into reality. So they had a vision, and how do you translate that vision into reality? We have a vision. It's called the family pledge. Lots of nice little, phrases. How do you translate that vision into reality? Something we haven't even thought about seriously, in my view. How do you translate the vision, all these things we call our ideals, into reality? So behind every law in the Mosaic Law, there's a story, there's a narrative. Okay. So after the break, I'm going to tell you the narrative, the story of Abraham and Isaac. And you'll understand it differently than the way you've understood it before, because you'll understand the meaning of the story in its own right and what it is, how it's connected to translating a vision into a reality. Okay. So welcome back, everybody. And I hope there was some food for thought there. And anyway, usually you'll find a lot of my views are completely off the wall and very different to other people. But as I always say, I don't expect you to believe everything I say. And in fact, if you do believe and agree with everything I say, I'll be deeply shocked and disappointed. Because I just want to, open up these kind of topics for thought, for consideration, and for thinking, really, as Vera was saying in her prayer. It's, it's all about thinking about these things. How are we going to translate our vision into reality? Has anybody ever tried to do it before? Yeah, that's what I often wonder, how has anybody ever tried to do it before? And of course, when Jesus appeared to Father on Easter Sunday, when he was, 16 years old or something, and Jesus said to him, I want you to inherit my mission and establish the kingdom of heaven on the earth. Then Father, being a very wise and sensible person, said no. Only an idiot would say yes. Eventually, after a lot of conversations, a lot of persuading, and eventually Father agreed to do that. But then suddenly you got this mission to take upon yourself to complete Jesus' ministry and to restore the world. What do? You look for a handbook. Where's the handbook to restore the world? Where's the handbook to build the kingdom of heaven? Where's the instruction manual for doing all these things? Has anybody ever done it before? Has anybody ever tried to do it before? Can I learn from anybody? And so Jesus, Father, picked up the Bible and he invested himself in studying the Bible very, very deeply, page after page, sentence after sentence. And that's what the principle is, the pattern for the natural subjugation of Satan, the pattern that was followed and established by first by Abel, beginnings, Noah's family, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Jesus. And so Father himself was following in the pattern of the forefathers, following the pattern that had been established, the victorious pattern for the natural subjugation of Satan, and also for the establishment of the foundation for the foundation to receive the Messiah on a national level. That's establishing the kingdom of heaven on a national level. And that's what God is doing here. He's establishing in Canaan the basic principles for a just and peaceful and good society on a national level, so that when the Messiah comes, it can then be expanded, to other people as well. So if we want to think about, okay, how do we build the kingdom of heaven? We can read this and we can think, oh, that's just for the Jews. But that's only because God chose them as a holy nation and a kingdom of priests to teach this principles and these rules and this way of life to the rest of humanity. So all humanity and all human beings could establish a just and peaceful and good society where they could flourish and have the freedom to be beautiful, to fulfill the three blessings, the freedom to pursue beauty, truth, and goodness, and a freedom to be able to create a God-centered society. So that's what God is doing here. He's trying to establish a God-centered society. So that's why we study this, then we can learn. And not think, oh, that's for the Jews. Actually, this is for all humanity. Okay, so, well, actually it wasn't. Even for the Mosaic law, that's only, a lot of it's only supposed to be for the Levites, one particular tribe. But in reality, a lot of Jews thought, oh, why should only the Levites follow these laws? Why shouldn't we all follow these laws? And so the strict laws, which are only supposed to be for the Levites originally, actually a lot of other Jews thought, well, we want to live according to those strict laws as well. We want to be a kingdom of priests. We want to follow the laws which originally were only revealed for the priests. Okay, so behind every law, as I said, there's a story. So this is a story of Abraham and Isaac. And you might wonder, what's this story really all supposed to be about? Well, it's establishing the value of the individual. So let's just unpack this, what's going on here. So after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here am I. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, turning the knife in here, and offer him as a burnt offering. So Abraham rose early in the morning. I'm pretty sure if God told me that, I wouldn't have got up early in the morning, really enthusiastically. I would have slept in. But anyway, Abraham rose early in the morning to do this. So the question is then, why did God test Abraham? Well, it says God tested Abraham. Well, the word test and miracle are the same word in Hebrew. So how can a test be a miracle? Well, a test then is doing something which we think is impossible. So supposing one day you went to a swimming pool and you'd never been diving before, but you see people, one person after another, climbing up to the, 10-meter board or whatever it is, and diving off or doing a double somersault or all these funny little acrobatic things they do. And you think, that looks fun. I would like to do that. So you climb up for the very first time in your life, you climb up to the top of the 10-meter diving board and you look over the edge. And instead of diving off, you step back. Why? Because you're afraid. So you have to think, is that fear rational or irrational? With that whole hour when you're sitting at the bottom on a chair watching people diving off, you never saw anybody break their neck. You never saw anybody break their back. You never saw anybody doing belly flop and all their guts got spilt all over the swimming pool, which is always my great fear. You never saw anybody break their leg when they jumped in. And so when you get to the top and you can't dive off or jump off yourself, that fear is stopping you. But that fear is not rational. There's no reason for doing that. It's a fear. That fear is a concept that one has within oneself. And then you have to decide, what am I going to do? And so you can watch videos of this, they're hilarious on the internet, of somebody in that situation, and one person after another passes them and dives in or jumps in, and they're standing there wondering trying to pluck up the courage to dive in or jump in. And if you can't pluck up the courage to do that, and you climb back down the ladder and you go home, you'll feel like you're a lesser person than you were before you went to the swimming pool. You feel diminished in stature. If, on the other hand, you can pluck up the courage and you hold your nose and you jump in and you hit the water and you go under the water and then you surface you feel incredible exhilaration. You feel extraordinary exhilaration. And what you do next is you do it again and again and again and again. And then when you go home, you feel like you're walking on air. You feel great. You feel like you're a much bigger person than you were before you left home, because you feel that actually I've broken through a barrier. I thought I've done something which I thought was impossible. I've broken a certain concept or way of thinking. And so that's and so you feel like it's like a miracle. And so that's the purpose of tests, not to see if someone's failing or passing, but it's like a test to move somebody out of their comfort zone so they do something they thought was impossible for them to be able to do. And that's part of growing in every way. You get tested, pushed out of your comfort zone when someone can see you have the potential to do something you don't believe you can do, and you do it and you feel, wow, that was a miracle. I didn't believe it was possible. So that's what's going on here. God is testing Abraham. Yeah. So up until now, Abraham had passed 9 tests. So sacrificing Isaac, though, was against everything that he believed in. It was violated all of his ideas of ethics, what was right and wrong. So the question is then, well, why did God ask him to do it? Of course, another question is, why was he willing to do it? And the third one is, why was Isaac willing to go along with it? When Isaac realized what was going on, because he was a teenager, he was able to carry the sticks, he knew what was going on. Why didn't he get on the mobile and call up social services and say, there's a serious violation of child rights is about to happen. Please, can you send the social services around with a protection order for me? Yeah. Why is Isaac willing to go along with it? And sometimes people say, well, the core of one's being lies not in the self, but in the commitment to the Creator. So if God tells you to do something, you should do it. That's what people often say. But the issue is then, when we look at it more deeply, we find out Abraham was chosen to be a role model. So God said, I've chosen him so he will instruct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. So sometimes people wonder, why did God choose Abraham? He wasn't rich or powerful or a great general or anything like that. God chose Abraham because he knew that Abraham would teach his family to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. So if Abraham is chosen to be a role model, how many of the descendants of Abraham have thought, oh, okay, Abraham's the role model, I better test my son to see if he's a good son and tell him tomorrow morning, God has told me I have to put you on the barbecue at the bottom of the garden. Let's test you to see if you're really good. People don't do that. So what's going on here? So people have wrestled with this issue. How do you deal with this? For me, for a long time, for me, this is the worst story in the whole of human literature. Yeah, because Abraham is a founder of faith for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. How can you believe in Abraham when he's willing to do such a terrible thing? How can you believe in God who's willing to ask him to do such a terrible thing? And so I used to hate teaching this story for years. I was always trying to find a way to make sense of this story, as have philosophers and theologians for generations, thousands of years. Anyway, Kierkegaard, who's a Danish existentialist philosopher, he talked about the teleological suspension of the ethical. Teleological means it's to do with purpose. So because you're doing something for a good reason, with a good motivation, it's okay to suspend the ethical. In other words, the end justifies the means. Because I'm doing it for a good end, therefore I can use any means that are necessary to achieve that end. As he said, the willingness to let the I-thou love of God overrule the universal principles that bind human beings to one another. So that's the issue then. I love God so much, it's okay to go and sacrifice my son. I love God so much, it's okay to go and rob a bank and distribute the money to the poor. I love God so much, it's okay for me to overtake because I've got to get to this place really quickly. Yeah, that's this idea here. The end justifies the means. Good motivation, I've got a good heart, therefore I can ignore all the normal rules and laws. So essentially, this is the logic of the religious fanatic, the inquisitor, the suicide bomber. an Islamist suicide bomber who blows himself up, and just before he blows himself up and kills all these ordinary people, he screams and shouts, God is great. Yeah, that's the logic. Yeah, I love God so much, it's okay for me to, in fact, it's the right thing for me to go and kill and murder all these people because it's advancing God's cause. Yeah. The logic of the Inquisitor. It's okay for me to torture this silly little Protestant or Jew so that I can persuade them to, just before they die, to recite the creed, the correct creed. But basically, God never asks us to do anything which is unethical. The whole of the biblical tradition is follow your conscience. Never do anything that's wrong. Yeah. That's the whole of the religious tradition and the biblical tradition is be blameless, follow your conscience. God never asks us to do anything unethical. The Old Testament's full of laws. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do that. Yeah. So there has to be another way of looking at this whole thing. And so the other way of looking at it is in terms of restoration. So what has been restored here? So when we think about restoration, we're thinking about something called the change of lineage. So let's try and look at it through this lens. So at the fall, the family was corrupted. Adam and Eve's family is corrupted. It created a corrupt family, which there's a lot of abuse. So when you look at the ancient family, you can see the religion was a domestic religion, and there's a lot of ancestor worship. So people would worship their ancestors, and one way in which they worship God and worship their ancestors was through practicing child sacrifice. In the ancient world, child sacrifice was not at all unusual. The second thing, in the ancient family, the fallen family, the head of the family had absolute authority. The head of the family was the man, the husband or the father, and he had the power of life and death over his wife and children. If he wanted to, he could put his children to death. He could sell his children to slavery. He could put his wife to death. He could sell his wife into slavery or trade her in for somebody else. And he had the legal authority to do that. It was not against the law because the head of the family had absolute authority. And it's still expressed there in the Roman law, patria potestas. Yeah, went on for a long time. You look at Roman history, that's the way it was. So why did the head of the family have absolute authority? On what basis? What legal basis? Because a man's wife and his children were all his property. So a man owned his wife and he owned his children. So because he owned his wife, like he owned a table or a cow or a horse, he was able to sell his wife, or he was able to sell his children. If he got into debt, he would sell his children into slavery. And he could do that because they belonged to him. They were his property. And then this authority then was inherited by the firstborn son. And if the firstborn son didn't like his mother, he could also have his mother put to death. You read not the Iliad, the Odyssey. Yeah, Penelope and her son, when Penelope starts talking, then her son, whose name I've forgotten, tells her to shut up because, he's the head of the family now. And so the biblical tradition rejects all of these, which are regarded as being pagan. Every single one of these points is rejected by the biblical tradition because every single one of these points is regarded as being fallen or pagan. So what's going on here? Through the course of restoration, God wants to abolish and change all these fallen traditions, change all these abusive relationships within the family. And that's what's going on here with the story of Abraham and Isaac. And so particularly child sacrifice is an abomination to God. It's one of the things denounced more than anything else within the Mosaic law is if people sacrifice, it's child sacrifice. Anybody who does this will himself be put to death because it profanes God's name. God hates it when people sacrifice their children. So the point is, these people who practice child sacrifice, it's not that they're not religious, because they really are. Why would they sacrifice their children? They sacrifice their children because there's nothing more precious for a parent than a child. There's nothing more pure than a baby. So these people who are incredibly devout, incredibly religious, are sacrificing, offering to God that which is most pure and precious for them, and that's their children. These are really religious people doing this. Yeah. But from God's point of view, how does he feel when these babies, his sons and daughters, get burnt. Doesn't like it. Yeah. So what authority, what right do people have to burn their children? What right do people have to sacrifice their children? Well, they could sacrifice their children because their children were their property. So they're giving to God something that belonged to them. Okay, when we look at the biblical worldview, though, it's completely different to that ancient pagan worldview. The first thing is, there's no sacrifice to dead ancestors anywhere in the Bible. The Jews are the first and only people in the ancient world who there's no evidence whatsoever they ever offered any sacrifices to dead ancestors. Instead, they would worship the one God of all humanity. That's why the Bible doesn't start off with Abraham. It starts off with Adam. Yeah, the recognition that from all human beings have a common origin in Adam. That means there's one God, all humanity worships the same God. Yeah, one God for all humanity. And so when people worship their dead ancestors, though, it means they're worshipping their ancestors, and so they feel closer to people who share the same ancestors that they do. And that becomes the origin then. Oh, you're part of my family, you're not. Particularly goes up to a tribal level often. Oh, we're connected because we share the same ancestors. We're connected because we're the same tribe. But that means you're from a different tribe to us. Therefore, you don't worship the same ancestors that we do. Therefore, we can treat you differently. Yeah, we can discriminate you. And it's okay to kill you, but it's not okay to kill each other. Yeah, so that's the consequence of ancestor worship, is that people discriminate between each other based upon ancestors instead of one God for all humanity. The second biblical concept from page 1 of the Bible then is that every single human being is a child of God. All human beings are the sons and daughters of God. Yeah. So this means, because all human beings are sons and daughters of God, means every single human being, every individual has divine, unique, and eternal value. Every individual has divine value because every individual is in the image of God. The ancient world, only the Pharaoh, the king, was the son of God. Only the Pharaoh, the king, was divine. Only the Pharaoh, the king, was unique in that sense and eternal. Whereas in the biblical tradition, every single individual has divine, unique, and eternal value, and every individual is the image of God. So that means then that because every human being is a son or daughter of God, it means parents don't own their children. Parents then are guardians, not owners of their children. Because, yeah. And that means then that children then belong to God. Children are not the property of parents. They're the property of God. They're God's children. And also the other thing in the biblical tradition is that father and mother have equal authority. That was one of the commandments we looked at last week. Honor your father and mother. Again, it's not the head of the household, the man who owns his wife and his children. A father and mother have equal authority. So what's going on here? When God is saying to Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son, your only son to me, the son that you love, as a burnt offering, what God is asking Abraham to do is to renounce his ownership of Isaac. Because Isaac was Abraham's only son, the son that he loved. So when God said to Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son, Abraham could have said, no, I will not sacrifice my son. And God would say, well, why won't you sacrifice your son to me? I'm telling you to sacrifice your son. And Abraham would say, he's my son, he's not yours. He's my property, I own him. If I want to sacrifice him to you, I can do that. But you have no right, you have no authority to ask me to sacrifice him or tell me to sacrifice him because he belongs to me, he's my property. Yeah. So what God is asking Abraham to do is to acknowledge that actually Isaac is not his property. That God, therefore, has the authority to ask Abraham to sacrifice Isaac because Isaac is God's property. Yeah? Children are not the property of their parents. Children belong to God. So through this incredible test, Abraham has been confronted with, is Isaac my son? Or is he God's son? Does he belong to me? Or does he belong to God? Yeah? And that's the issue here. And so God is also asking Isaac to acknowledge that he belongs to God. So when Abraham explains all this to Isaac, Isaac could have said, whoa, that's not what I was planning to do with my life. This is my life. I've got all these plans of what I'm going to do with my life. How dare God take my life away from me? How dare you ask me to do this? It's my life. So what God is asking Isaac to do is to acknowledge that he also belongs to God. Yes, I belong to God. I'm God's property. Therefore, God has a right to do with me whatever it is that he wishes to do. I'm God's property. And so, as it says here, this is the rabbinic understanding of the story. The principle to which the entire story of Isaac, from birth to binding, is opposed to is the idea that a child is the property of a father. Difficulty in having children taught that children they bore were the children of God, rather than just a natural occurrence of a biological process. So we saw there that Sarah, also later Rebecca, also later Rachel, and also Moses, I think Moses, anyway, found it very hard to have children. And so they prayed to God. And so they actually got children from God. What God was doing when he asked Abraham to offer up his son was not requesting a child sacrifice, but something quite different. He wanted Abraham to renounce ownership of his son. He wanted to establish a non-negotiable principle of Jewish law, and not just Jewish law, but international law, that children are not their property of their parents. As long as parents believed they owned their children, the concept of the individual could not yet be born. The fundamental unit was the family. The Bible represents the birth of the individual as a central figure in the moral life. So every individual then has a conscience. Every individual has to take moral responsibility for their life. They can't just say, oh, I was just following orders from my parents or from my king or from my teacher. Every individual then is a central figure for their own personal moral life, as accountable to God and their conscience for everything they think, say, and do. Because all children belong to God, parenthood is not ownership but guardianship. As soon as they reach the age of maturity, traditionally 12 for girls and 13 for boys, children become independent moral agents with their own dignity and freedom. So if we think about this in terms of our own theology, which is all about the change of blood lineage or change of lineage, that's what Father said. Where's the change of blood lineage done? On the individual level, man has to go beyond the boundary of life and death, and the individual has to go through this life and death situations for the sake of God and the future dignity of man. So you can say then that Abraham and Isaac definitely went through the boundary of life and death. Abraham went through several situations where he had to choose between following his conscience and at the risk of his life declaring that he believed in God, that God was a reality even if he was going to be put to death. And also Isaac as well had to go through this. And for the sake of God and the future dignity of man. So they went through it for that purpose. So what's going on here? We talk about the future dignity of a human being, which they're restoring. So this event then between Abraham and Isaac established that every human being is a child of God, has an individual value. So that's what the change of lineage is. It was established that every single human being is a son or daughter of God. Yeah, that's like the change of lineage from being, oh, you're my children, I own you, to actually you are God's children, and I've got, which means that parents then are guardians. So parents only have the duty to look after their children, to love their children, to feed their children, to educate their children, and help their children to fulfill their potential as God's sons and daughters. That means parents don't own their children. So parents don't have the right to control their children, to manage their children when they grow up, but actually only have the authority and responsibility to look after their children and help their children to reach adulthood and become sons and daughters of God. That's why Father says you have to treat your children as princes and princesses of God. Yeah, this is God's prince that I have the great honor and privilege to be able to look after. This is God's princess. God has given me his princess to bring up, to look after, to treasure, to cherish, to help and to support and to encourage, and certainly not to damage, certainly not to sacrifice, certainly not to neglect. Yeah. So this idea then that every human being is a son or daughter of God means that every human being has individual value. So this is the beginning of the end of slavery. If every human being is God's property, how is it possible for another human being to own another human being? How is it? It's not possible for a man to own his wife if his wife is God's property? If his wife is God's daughter and belongs to God, how can he claim to own his wife? How can he claim to own his children? How can he claim to own any other human being? Because slavery then is theft. Yeah. This is the beginning of the end of slavery, this recognition that every individual is a son or daughter of God and has unique, divine, eternal value. So a man then cannot own his wife or his children or another human being. So this is the beginning of the change of lineage. Yeah, this is the turning point in human history. A wife is a daughter of God and the feminine expression of God, and so as such should be treated with love and respect and cherished and worshipped. Yeah? At the same time, a husband is a son of God, God's prince, and a masculine expression of God, and should be treated with love and respect and cherished and worshipped. So this transforms the understanding of what an individual is, transforms all relationships between people. Every single human being then should be treated with absolute respect, because every single human being is a son or daughter of God. Every single being is a unique expression of God. Every single being has unique value, and is God, belongs to God. Yeah. So it transforms. It's a beginning of the transformation of all relationships. Yeah. And of course, this is 4,000 years ago, and it takes a long time for all this to start working its way through history. First into Abraham's family, Jacob's family, the Israelites, Jewish people, and then with Jesus, it becomes more worldwide through Christianity. And then finally, in the 19th century, we see the abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery. And we can still see all the echoes of this going on today. It's taken 4,000 years for the implications of this idea that everybody has individual value to finally work their way through this corrupt, fallen society. And yeah, so how can you be a racist if you recognize this person is God's son, this person is God's daughter? I have to treat this person with great respect. I cannot treat this person as representing a particular category, gender, racial category, etc., etc. I have to treat this person that way. This is a much surer foundation than what's called human rights. There's no philosophical basis for human rights. You know, you can talk to anybody, try and get to the bottom of it. There's no solid, secure philosophical basis for the idea of human rights, and that's why, etc. But there is a solid foundation. It's human beings belong to God. It's a legal definition. Human beings are God's property. They might know, well, actually, Father said the same sort of thing. Now you come to the position where Father will change your lineage in God's sight. Now you become God's property. Yeah, same idea, same legal concept. You're the property of God. And Satan will have no way to claim you. You can be placed in the storehouse of God. Even if Satan were to kidnap you and put you in prison, you can have complete confidence that no one can really touch you. Satan, you have no power over me because the true parents have changed my lineage. I no longer belong to you. I belong to God. Yes, change of lineage is change of identity. I'm the son of God, I'm the daughter of God. That's where my dignity comes from, everything else. And so are you, the son or daughter of God, and that then becomes a basis of mutual respect for each other. And so these are the sort of links in the change of lineage. We saw that was Abraham and Isaac, established the principle that every human being belongs to God. But, you know, not everybody really wants to go through that. And so that's why within the Jewish people and also Muslims, the Jews, they circumcise their sons on the 8th day. And the 8th day, they dedicate their son to God, and that son becomes a member of the covenant. Yeah, becomes a member of the covenant. But it's connected to exactly the same event. You're dedicating your son, you dedicate your children to God, say, this is your son, and I promise to take care of your son. Yeah, so each individual then becomes a member of the covenant. It means each individual then is recognized they are the son or daughter of God, and they have that dignity being the son or daughter of God, and to parents and the guardians to look after them. Anyway, we have a similar thing called the 8-day ceremony. The blessed parents dedicate their children to God, and promise to take care of them on God's behalf. Now, some of you may remember that. And yeah, so that's the same thing. And you have to ask yourself, well, which of these three would you like to go through? Abraham and Isaac, circumcision on the 8th day, or the 8-day dedication ceremony? Well, it's called the merit of the age. But the point is the meaning is exactly the same. The significance is exactly the same with these three things. Yeah, it's called the merit of the age. You don't have to go through that, but you have to understand what it is that one is doing. And it's also to do, going back to Adam and Eve, it's to do the restoration of the parent-child relationship here. So when Eve became pregnant, when she first gave birth, Eve said, "With the help of the Lord, I've acquired a man." And so that's why she called her son Cain. So the word Cain in Hebrew, keniti, means acquired. So from her point of view, she felt, I have acquired a son. This is my son. He is my property. He belongs to me. So you can see there that Eve was an incredibly possessive mother. She felt, this is my child. I own my child. My child belongs to me. My child is my property. And of course, very, very possessive. What do you do if you've got a very, very possessive mother? Either you become crushed or you rebel. And Cain rebelled. So it's, the wrong relationship, wrong understanding of the relationship between parent and child. So through this, then it's like the restoration of lineage, restoration of 4 great realms of heart, and the restoration of the relationship between the parent and child to establish the principle that parents do not own their children, but children are the sons and daughters of God. Yeah. And so this then informed the whole of the Jewish tradition, as Jonathan Sacks said. It then informed the whole of the Christian tradition, and it formed the whole of the origin of Western liberalism. So people think, oh, Western liberalism, that all goes back to John Locke, or maybe it goes back to the Greeks. But actually this person here, he traced it back. He said, no, it goes all the way back to the story of Abraham and Isaac. And so that's why when Jews pray every day, they remember that story of Abraham and Isaac, and Muslims do as well. When they're at the end of Hajj, they sacrifice a sheep or a lamb. It's connected to that, the binding of Isaac, when Abraham, or binding of Ishmael, they would say, when instead of sacrificing his son, Abraham and his son sacrificed a sheep or a lamb. So again, incredibly, so it's a turning point in human history. But of course, if you don't understand this story properly, either you become a religious fanatic and you feel the end justifies the means, and that's horrendous, or you just become appalled. How is it possible for God to ask Abraham to do that? How is it possible for Abraham to be willing to do that? How is it possible for Isaac to be willing to do that? How can this event be the founding event of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? Yeah, so one needs to really understand what's going on here. And I think the principle, understanding the change of lineage, change of identity, provides the best explanation of trying to unravel this story and explain the real meaning of this story. As I said, it's about translating vision into reality. So here you had that vision then, that every single human being is a son or daughter of God. Slavery is impossible. And so what these laws are doing then, they're trying to translate this vision into reality. So when they left Egypt, they were slaves in Egypt. Then they had the Exodus, and they went to live in Canaan. So how do you translate this historical experience of memory of moving from slavery into freedom into legislation? Yeah. So the reality is, when they left Egypt, there was some slavery. So, as I said, behind every law, there's this story, this narrative. And behind these laws about the abolition of slavery lies this vision that every single individual has unique, divine, eternal value, that every single individual belongs to God, is the property of God. And so that's the way it is. So in the Mosaic Law, it says there's still slavery, but let's have a look and see what's going on here. God wants to abolish slavery. So how do you go about doing it? So it says here, if you buy a Hebrew slave, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year, he's to go free. So you might wonder, well, how can you buy a Hebrew slave? Well, okay, this is often the way in which it would this is how a person would fall into slavery. There may be somebody who's being so bad at managing his or her finances that they fall into such incredible debt. The only way they can repay their debt is to sell themselves into slavery, to work for free for somebody for 6 years, yeah, and to repay the debt. Okay, so here you got the idea. You can buy a Hebrew slave, but he's to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he should go free. So what does that mean? That means slavery is temporary and not a matter of birth. In traditional slave societies, if you're born a slave, if your parents are slaves, it means you're born a slave. Slavery is a matter of birth. Yeah. Okay. Whereas here, slavery is not a matter of birth. It's just a matter of circumstance that somebody happens to have got themselves into this situation. The slavery then is inherently temporary and not a matter of birth. It's not a permanent status or stage like it was, in sort of Hindu society. We looked at the untouchables and everything like that. The second principle here is, if a person is a slave, then they can only work for 6 years, and the 7th year they have to be set free. You can't keep them as a slave for more than 6 years. And 7th year, they then become a free person. But the reality is that some people, they actually find being a slave more comfortable. You don't have to worry about taking responsibility. You don't have to worry about making decisions. You just have to do as you're told. And as long as you do as you're told, you're in a state of dependency, and all your needs will be looked after. Your slave master will provide you with housing. Your slave master will provide you with a schedule. Your slave master will provide you with food and everything else. And for some people, it's much more comfortable. It's like being institutionalized. Yeah. Some people, when they've been in prison for quite a few years, they leave prison, they feel really uncomfortable. They don't know how to manage themselves, yeah? And so they sometimes commit some kind of petty crime so they can get themselves put it back into prison where they fall into a state of dependency again. So the law here is, if a slave doesn't want to be free, then a person has to take an awl, which is a spike, and put it through their ear, yeah? So everybody can see this person has chosen to be a slave, yeah? He doesn't have to be a slave, but he's chosen to be a slave. So the next law is, if anyone who beats their slave must be punished if the slave dies as a result. So again, in the ancient world, if you owned a slave, you could kill your slave, and it was not against the law because you're just destroying your property. You could burn your table. It's no greater crime than killing your cow or anything else, because your slave is your property. So here, though, in the Mosaic law, it's a crime. That's because slaves are not property, and slaves have a right to death. So anybody who has a slave for 6 years and beats their slave to death, that person should be punished. In the traditional slave societies, slave owners are not punished for beating or killing their own slaves because they're property, personal property. And then the third law is that on a Sabbath, your slave is not to work. So again, there's always this risk of people becoming institutionalized. So here the principle is that even a slave on the Sabbath is not to work. So it means a slave can also breathe the air of freedom. The slave can also breathe the air of not having to follow anybody's orders on the Sabbath. Nobody can tell him what to do. He now is completely free and responsible. So he can breathe the air of freedom, so that after 6 years, he's still functioning as a moral entity, a moral being. So this is how it is. How do you translate this vision to reality? That's how you did it, yeah? So you can see here, okay, that means within a very short space of time, there'll be no more slavery. That's the end of slavery within the Jewish community very, very quickly. Yeah, only lingers on with people who voluntarily want to be slaves. But it's not just for the Hebrews. Then this was also supposed to be extended then to everybody else. So that's why God said, one of the commandments, you shall not oppress a stranger, because you yourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt. I told you that last week. You shall not oppress a stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. In other words, if there's a foreigner who comes to stay with you, you shouldn't treat him in that way. So this law about getting rid of slavery very easily then can be extended to anybody who's living within the land of Israel. Yes. And then from there, as I said, on a national foundation with the abolition of slavery, then from there, it took about another 3,500 years before it became universalized. Yeah, anyway, it's got to start somewhere. So you can see here, it's a very, very practical way of how to do things. Practical way of how to translate the vision of the individual value of every single human being into practice. It's like a transition, yeah. Development, not overnight. Okay, this is another thing, which is conflict resolution. This is quite a big section. So I'm going to leave this till tomorrow, because lots of practical things, you know. As I said, it's all to do with biblical political economy, how to create a good and just society. One of the issues that comes up again and again within society, people get hurt, they want to have revenge, etc., etc., etc. So what's the biblical law about how to solve problems, about conflict resolution? Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing here. All right, I don't want to prattle on forever. Vera, do you want to wrap up with a prayer?
Yeah, I'll say, please join me in prayer. Oh, dear Heavenly Parents, dear true parents, thank you for all these things we could listen to. And I pray that they can be seeds in our mind and that you can guide us to more deeply understand this life and each other, and also be open to challenge our own thinking. We thank you for all of the things you give to us every day, and we want to have a big heart just like you have, and remember the value that each person has in your eyes. We thank you for everything, and I wish a good rest for all the participants here and for Uncle William. This I pray in our name, all of our names, and my own name, Veronian, wife of blessed sinful couple. Aju.
Aju. All right, so thank you all very much. Have a good day, good afternoon, or good evening, or if you need to go to bed now, then off you go. Thank you very much. God bless you, and hope to see you all tomorrow.